Glazing is my favourite part of the process, by which I mean developing and testing glazes. The actual dipping and pouring is less interesting, but I know a lot of potters dread it. It's understandable. It's the final stage in a long process and can easily ruin weeks of work. There's no magic cure for that. Ceramics can be harsh and unforgiving, but there are ways to make the most of your glazes. Here are my top 10 tips for getting to grips with your glazes. The real trick to enjoying glazing is loving, or at least not hating, the results you get, and a lot of that is just not inadvertently messing it up. Test, test, test. There is no substitute for time spent testing. Depending on where you are in your glazing journey, this could mean a variety of different things. If you're using pre-made glazes, whether bought or from a shared studio, then you still have a variety of things you can find out. You ideally should know what each glaze looks like at various thicknesses. Some glazes are totally different at different thicknesses, some are identical. You need to know if a glaze result requires a certain application. How a glaze changes over smooth and textured surfaces. This matters less if you only ever use one surface type, but knowing how behaviour changes between a ribbed, smooth, lightly textured, or heavily textured, stamped, slipped, etc. surface will give a lot of information about the glaze. What a glaze will look like over various clays, slips or underglazes, if you use them. Some glazes will totally change over different coloured clay. A thinner application of the floating blue recipe I use is very sensitive to the clay it's on, and it's good to know that when applying it. I don't like how it looks when it's thin over white clay, so I make sure to apply it thicker, but I do love the thin application over black slip or underglaze. What glazes do in combination? It's not always what you think. It's nothing like mixing paint. If they merge together, you're combining two recipes to come up with a totally new one. And if they stay separate, then you can get things like oil spot patterns, where the physical movement of one glaze in the firing will create an entirely new pattern. Test a glaze over and under another glaze to see what works best. If you use oxide washes, test the glaze over those too. This is similar to combining glazes, but generally more straightforward. Kiln location. It's not usually a factor, but if the glaze responds to slow cooling, then placement can totally change the result. What glazes do at different scales? Going from a test tile to a full piece isn't always as straightforward as it should be. Test at a larger scale before committing to a full batch of glaze. If you're wondering whether you should be buying pre-made glazes or mixing your own, the simple answer is to do what's right for you. Making your own has a bunch of advantages in the long run, but there are plenty of good reasons to use pre-made. If you want to make your own but don't know where to start, I have videos on the First 5 or Freedom 5 projects, which would be the easiest place to start with a whole bunch of interesting recipes and the fewest possible ingredients. And if you want interesting pre-made glazes, there are a few companies doing interesting things like Midnight Ceramics. If you make your own glazes but you're not comfortable with the chemistry, then you can try removing the colorants, swapping them for others. Again, this isn't like mixing paints. You might find it does something unexpected. It will probably change other aspects of the behavior too, so treat it as an entirely new glaze if you do this. And after all the testing, put all but the best tiles aside for reference later and only continue with a tiny percentage of them. Curation is just as important as testing. Pay attention to thickness. Depending on the glaze, this can be the most important factor to getting the results you want. Clear glazes generally benefit from being thin to limit cloudiness and bubbles. Opaque glazes of a single colour can be thick or thin depending on how much you want the clay to show through. Where it becomes crucial is with layered flowing glazes. If you apply these too thinly, you probably won't get the colour or movement you're looking for. One thing you will almost certainly encounter if you try to apply multiple glazes thickly is that there can be a tendency towards cracking or peeling off as the glaze dries. This usually results in crawling when fired, which is where patches of the clay are left exposed as the glaze pulls away. If you have this issue with a thin layer of a single glaze, then there are ways to fix it. It's caused by excessive shrinking as the glaze dries, and this can be reduced by using less water and possibly deflocculating the mix to keep it fluid, and or using calcined clay in place of a portion of the clay in the recipe. However, even if your glazes are perfectly happy going on in a single thick application, when combined in thick layered applications you can often have issues. I get around this by applying my flowing glazes a little thinner initially, then coming back the next day and brushing a little more glaze onto the key areas where I want to get movement. I find this is far less likely to cause crawling, although it will vary between glazes and might not work as well for you. It is sometimes possible to bisque fire the first glaze before applying the second. It requires another firing, but this way the glaze is permanently fused in place and cannot crawl. This only works with glazes that have the right amount of melt at whatever bisque temperature you use. Just glaze a piece as you normally would and put it through your usual bisque firing. Check each glaze with test tiles first though. If it works correctly, then the glaze will be fused in place but still be porous, allowing for a second glaze to be applied as normal. This technique is also useful if you want to build up a glaze to a thickness that would be a problem otherwise. Some glazes will want to be fused at a temperature lower than your bisque, and when you fire them to your bisque temperature, they will actually start to become melted and no longer porous. If they then craze, this can produce interesting results when you dip a second glaze in. Weigh the application. The easiest way to measure how much glaze is being added to a test or a full piece is to weigh it before and after the application. Dipping time on its own is a fairly meaningless number, especially when comparing your application results to someone else's. The porosity of a clay is determined by the clay body and the bisque temperature. Two different pieces could take up a totally different amount of glaze even if they were dipped in the same bucket of glaze for the same amount of time. If you're going to pay attention to one number when testing glazes, weight of application is the one to track. You'll want to zero a set of scales to the weight of the piece or the test tile before adding the glaze, then weigh and record the weight after glazing. This works for dipping, pouring or brushing a glaze, although if brushing a full piece you might want to just record the start and end weights separately in case the scales time up before you finish. You do need to know how much water is in the glaze mix, but you should keep track of that anyway if you want predictable results. Alternatively, if you weigh the piece before glazing and then allow the glaze to fully dry and weigh the piece afterwards, you will have the dry weight of the glaze, which can also be useful. Once you've established your target number for weight of glaze per piece, you don't need to weigh every single piece, but knowing what the right application weighs will be invaluable if you start having issues with consistency. Understand your glazes. As per the previous points, understanding your glazes comes in several layers. At the basic end, you just want to understand how your glazes, bought or made, behave in various different conditions. That will get you a long way, but comes with limitations. The next stage is to understand the chemistry that the glazed recipe represents, as that's all a ceramic recipe really is at the end of the day. The chemistry determines the behavior, and the recipe is one of the many ways to achieve that chemistry. By understanding what each ingredient brings to the mix, you can start to understand why recipes produce the results they do, and how to adjust them to change the characteristics. I can't recommend the ceramic materials workshop classes highly enough for really getting to grips with the chemistry of glaze ingredients. They have a few different courses, and I've done most of them and written about them on my blog, but the easiest place to start if you fire to Cone 6 is the Middle Glazes course, and I have a discount code for that which will get you 25% off, which I will stick in the video description. Whatever level you're at with glazing, keeping detailed notes will really help you build a relationship with your glazes. It doesn't guarantee that you won't have issues with them, but will be invaluable when it comes to solving them. Make the most of tests. I've done a longer video on this recently, but you can fit more than one test on a test tile. Ideally, you want to know how a glaze behaves over all the conditions you'd usually use it. So over smooth and or textured surfaces, over the base clay, and over underglaze or slip or oxide washes, whatever makes the most sense for your processes. You can add several of these to the same test tiles. When throwing test tiles, I'd smooth one side with a rib and add bands of slip to see how the glaze behaves over both surface types. I add coloured slip to the reverse side to see how the glaze behaves over different base colours, and this allows me to get several tests into a single test tile, and it only takes a moment to add these additional aspects when making the tiles. Don't rush. Easily overlooked when the deadline is looming, but it's almost never worth rushing. Whether that's glazing a full load in a relatively untested glaze and hoping there are no issues, trying to get a single piece glazed and straight into a firing, or mixing a batch of glaze when you don't have time or mental space to check as you go, I find I regret it more often than I don't. On a similar note, don't use untested combinations on pieces that you like. I know it's tempting, you have a unique piece and you think you can make it even better by using a brand new combination of glazes that work perfectly in your head. I've done it so many times and I've always regretted it. Be consistent. Applying glaze is only a small portion of glazing. There are several other aspects that it's important not to overlook if you want consistent results. Bisque firing temperature. The temperature you fire to will affect the porosity of your bisqueware, and it will affect each clay differently too. This is less of an issue if you weigh the glaze application. If you just dip for a given time, the bisque temperature can dramatically affect how much glaze is taken up. There's no right bisque temperature, but keeping yours consistent will make it much easier to get a consistent glaze application. how you prepare glazes. Some ingredients, like tin and titanium, will tend towards clumping even though they are produced as a very fine powder. A high-speed immersion blender is a great way to thoroughly mix up a glaze test without sieving, but it is powerful enough to break the tiny clumps up far more than slower speed mixing and sieving. This changes how the materials behave in the glaze and can give a totally different result, meaning an immersion blended test won't necessarily give the same result when scaled up and mixed differently. The best way around the issue is to either never use an immersion blender or always use an immersion blender. It only matters on the ingredients that are sensitive to it. These can be blended separately and added to a larger batch to avoid burning out a motor blending a large batch of glaze, but it's important to stay consistent with whichever way you pick. Prepare your bisqueware. Try to avoid handling the area that we glazed, especially with dirty or oily hands, and clean off any dust before glazing. Oil and dust can work almost like a resist, preventing the glaze from sticking to the pot and potentially causing crawling. Check for sharp points. Slightly contradictory to the previous point, just make sure your hands are clean first. Run your hands over the rim and handle before glazing. Any sharp points should be sanded off before glazing. Don't ignore them, they'll ruin the piece and can't be fixed after glazing. It's even better to get in the habit of also checking this before loading a bisque kiln, as it's so much easier to remove sharp points on greenware than bisqueware. Let them dry. Let the pots dry overnight before firing if you can. Water in the kiln is never a good thing, especially if it's still in the piece when the temperature starts getting hot, as the steam leaving the piece can increase the likelihood of issues like crawling. I leave pieces overnight and I have an hour hold at 100°C at the start of every firing to fully dry out everything. Use drip catchers. Finally, fire anything you think might run, and assume any untested glaze will run, on something that will protect your shelves. Even better, use something with a raised centre, like my wheel-thrown drip catchers, which allow for a little more glaze movement without sticking. It allows you to take slightly more risks with your glazing without ruining pieces or shelves. I also asked on Instagram for top glazing tips, and here are a few of the best ones. Document everything you do. Dilute wax resist with water. It goes on much easier and does a better job of letting the glaze run back off. And I personally dilute my wax resist about 1 part wax to 3 or 4 parts water, so quite heavily diluted. Make doubly sure there's no glaze on the bottom of the piece, and you can use a piece of wet carpet to clean the glaze off the bottom of dipped pieces. It's best to clean glaze splashes or mistakes when they're dry by scraping the glaze off rather than trying to do it while they're still wet. Try and get at least one experiment into every kiln load. If you've been using a glaze for a little while, make sure to mix it back up every now and then, and keep an open mind when evaluating results. Give yourself the evening and sleep on it. Tiles look different the next day. Please let me know in the comments if there's anything you agree, disagree with, or if there is any tips that you would add.